The underworld of Chicago didn't just respect Julian Frost. They feared his silence more than most men's screams. They called him the Iron Saint, a man who ruled with a Bible in his left hand and a heavy-caliber pistol in his right. He was the architect of a golden era, a kingpin who kept the city's monsters on a short leash. But tonight, the saint has fallen, and the leash is broken. The air at the docks smells of ozone, wet asphalt, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Rain falls in a relentless gray sheet, soaking into the white cashmere coat of the man lying motionless on the ground. Julian Frost is dead. The iron is cold. But as the rival syndicates move in like vultures to strip the carcass of his empire, they stop dead in their tracks. Because standing over the body isn't a fleet of soldiers or a grieving widow. It's Ethan, 7 years old, his hair neatly combed to the side and dripping with rain. Ethan doesn't cry. He doesn't tremble. He stands with a terrifying, adult stillness, his small hand white-knuckled as he grips his father's massive gold signet ring. Behind him, four of the most dangerous men in the state stand like a wall of black granite, paralyzed not by the enemy, but by the look in the boy's eyes. The vultures think they've found an easy meal. They don't realize that the Iron Saint's final secret wasn't buried with him. It's standing right in front of them, and he's already decided who dies first. Julian Frost didn't build his empire on the broken remains of his enemies. He built it on the unwavering weight of his word. In a city where loyalty was a currency that devalued by the hour, Julian was the Iron Saint, a man whose code was as rigid as the steel beams of the skyscrapers he owned. He moved through the gilded halls of New York with a paradoxical grace, a predator who wore a crucifix under his shirt and carried a rosary in the same pocket as a switchblade. He believed that power without a soul was merely thuggery, and so he ruled with a terrifying brand of sanctity. He was the man who would pay for a widow's mortgage in the morning and, by evening, order the execution of the loan shark who had dared to harass her. To the NYPD, he was a ghost they couldn't catch because he did their job better than they did, keeping the streets clean of the cheap narcotics and disorganized violence that ruined neighborhoods. To the rival families, he was a nightmare wrapped in a bespoke white suit. He had earned his moniker during the Great Syndicate War, where he had systematically dismantled 3 rival families not through mindless slaughter, but through a surgical, iron discipline that left no room for error. Julian was the only man who could sit at a table of wolves and make them pray before they ate. He understood that fear was a temporary tool, but respect, anchored in a strict, almost religious adherence to a moral boundary, was eternal. But beneath the legendary persona of the Iron Saint was a secret he guarded more fiercely than his ledgers: his son, Ethan. While Julian navigated a world of blood and betrayal, he spent his private hours teaching Ethan the difference between a king and a tyrant. He showed the boy that a man's true strength wasn't in his ability to inflict pain, but in his ability to control it. "The ring is heavy, Ethan," he would whisper, touching the gold signet on his finger as they sat in the quiet library of their estate. "But it is not a weapon. It is a seal. It means your word is law, and your law must be just." Julian knew the peace he had forged was fragile. He knew the mid-level bosses, the vultures, hated his sanctity even more than they feared his iron. They chafed under his rules, waiting for a single moment of weakness. Julian lived every day knowing he was a target, yet he never traded his white cashmere for a bulletproof vest. He walked the streets openly, a saint among sinners, believing that his legacy would protect his blood. He had spent a lifetime making himself immortal in the eyes of the city, unaware that the very men who kissed his ring were already sharpening the knives they would soon drive into his back. He was a man of iron, ruling a world of glass, never suspecting that the first crack would come from the person he trusted most. The sky over the city didn't just cry that night. It mourned in a violent, unrelenting deluge that washed the salt from the air and replaced it with the scent of impending copper. Julian Frost stood on the edge of the pier, his white cashmere coat a stark, ghostly contrast against the charcoal horizon. He had come to meet his inner circle, the men he called brothers, But as the black sedans pulled into a semicircle, their headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of predatory deep-sea fish, the Iron Saint felt a familiar, cold prickle at the base of his neck. It wasn't the wind. It was the sudden, deafening silence of loyalty breaking. Ethan sat in the back of Julian's armored car, swinging his legs, his small hands resting on a velvet-lined box. He watched through the tinted glass as his father turned toward the car, his expression not one of fear, but of a profound, weary disappointment. Julian knew the geometry of an ambush. He saw the way Victor, his right hand, kept his fingers hovered inches from his holster. He saw the shadows moving in the peripheral, hitmen from the very families he had once stabilized. The vultures had finally stopped waiting for him to grow old. In 3 long strides, Julian reached the car door and pulled it open. The rain lashed into the leather interior, but he didn't seem to notice. He leaned in, his face inches from Ethan's. For a heartbeat, the terrifying Iron Saint was gone, replaced by a father desperate to save the only pure thing he had left. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy gold signet ring, pressing it into Ethan's small palm. The metal was still warm from his skin. "Listen to me, Ethan," Julian whispered, his voice a low, melodic rasp that drowned out the thunder. "They think they are killing a man. They don't realize they are starting a fire. This ring isn't just gold. Inside the band, there is a sequence, numbers that open the vault beneath the chapel. That is the secret. That is the soul of the city. If I don't walk back to this car, you don't cry. You don't scream. You become the iron. You lead the men behind you. Do you understand?" Ethan looked at the ring, then up at his father's eyes. He didn't nod like a child. He stared with a terrifying, ancient intensity. Julian saw the transformation happen in real time. The light of childhood flickering out, replaced by the cold, blue steel of the Frost legacy. "I understand, father," the boy said, his voice as steady as the rain. Julian smiled, a sharp, tragic twist of the lips, and closed the door. He turned back to the circle of headlights just as the first flash of muzzle fire ignited the dark. The sound of the glass shattering was the last thing Ethan heard before the world turned into a cacophony of lead and betrayal. Through the spider-webbed window, Ethan watched the white coat fall, but he didn't make a sound. He simply closed his fist around the ring and waited for the door to open. The saint was dead, but the secret was safe in the hands of a boy who had just forgotten how to weep. The echoes of the gunfire were still bouncing off the corrugated metal of the warehouses when the first of the rival sedans screeched to a halt, their tires churning the bloody rainwater into a murky pink froth. The vultures had arrived earlier than expected, drawn by the scent of a dying god. Victor, Julian's former right hand, stepped out of the lead car, his face twisted into a mask of mock grief that didn't quite reach his hungry, predatory eyes. He expected to find a vacuum. He expected to find a headless empire ready to be carved up like a Sunday roast. Instead, he found a wall. 4 of the Iron Saint's most lethal personal guards, men who had seen the inside of hell and walked out smiling, stood in a perfect, rigid semicircle. They were drenched, their black suits clinging to their massive frames, their expressions as unreadable as gravestones. But it wasn't the guards that made Victor hesitate. It was the small figure standing at the center of their protection. Ethan stood directly over the motionless body of his father, the white cashmere of Julian's coat now a roadmap of crimson stains. The boy's hair was plastered to his forehead, and droplets of rain clung to his lashes, yet he didn't blink. In his right hand, he held the gold signet ring. It was so large that his fingers had to curl tightly just to keep it from slipping, making his small fist look like a golden mace. He didn't look like a grieving son. He looked like a judge. "Move aside, kid," Victor called out, his voice cracking with a nervous bravado. He stepped forward, flanked by a dozen gunmen, his hand outstretched toward the ring. "That's a man's burden. You're just a boy playing in a storm. Give me the ring, and I'll make sure you have a comfortable life far away from here." The air grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure dropping as if the storm itself was holding its breath. Ethan didn't retreat. He didn't look at the guns leveled at his chest. He looked directly into Victor's soul with a gaze so sharp and devoid of childhood that the older man actually flinched. The four giants behind Ethan shifted as one, the metallic snick of safeties being disengaged, cutting through the sound of the downpour like a guillotine blade. My father told me that the vultures would come before the body was even cold, Ethan said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying a weight that should have been impossible for a 7-year-old. He told me they would speak of comfort while reaching for his crown. He raised the golden ring, the cold blue light of the pier catching the engraved F on the face of the metal. You are standing on frost ground, Victor, and you have forgotten the first rule of the saint. Ethan took a single step forward, the four guards moving in perfect synchronization with him, a living fortress of shadow and lead. The iron does not bend, and it certainly does not pass to a traitor. The silence that followed was more deafening than the thunder. For the first time in his life, Victor felt the true meaning of fear, not from the man he had killed, but from the child he had underestimated. The boy in the rain wasn't an orphan to be pitied. He was a king who had already begun his reign. The black sedans of the Frost estate didn't head for the penthouse or the fortified villas upstate. Instead, they bled into the industrial veins of the city, weaving through the labyrinthine alleys of the meatpacking district where the steam from the sewers acted as a natural shroud. Inside the lead car, the silence was heavy, pressurized by the realization that the world they had known an hour ago had been incinerated. The four guards, Silas, Cale, Marcus, and Jude, were men of war, but as they glanced at the rearview mirror, they saw a boy who looked less like a survivor and more like a ghost seeking a vessel. "They're behind us," Silas whispered, his voice tight. He was the eldest, a man who had taken a bullet for Julian in 3 different decades. He watched the headlights of 2 nondescript SUVs closing the distance, their movements aggressive and synchronized. Victor's trackers. They aren't going to let us reach the safe house. We should turn and fight, Ethan. We can buy you time to run. Ethan didn't look back at the pursuers. He was staring at a crumpled map of the city's old subway expansions that his father had kept in the door pocket. His small thumb traced a line that didn't exist on modern GPS. "No," the boy said, his voice a chilling anchor in the chaos. "If you fight now, you die for a memory. I need you to live for a future. Turn left on 14th, then take the service ramp into the lower loading docks of the old brewery." "That's a dead end, kid," Jude grunted, his hand tightening on his submachine gun. "We'll be trapped in a box." "It's not a dead end if you know where the floor opens," Ethan replied, finally turning his gaze toward Silas. The intensity in his eyes was so profound that Silas felt a shiver of recognition. It was the same look Julian had when he was 3 moves ahead of a massacre. "Trust the iron, Silas. Or leave the car now." Silas didn't hesitate. He swung the wheel, the tires screaming as they banked into the dark, cavernous mouth of the abandoned brewery. The tracking SUVs followed, sensing blood, their engines roaring in the confined space. As they reached the center of the derelict floor, Ethan leaned forward and pressed a sequence of buttons on the car's console, a code his father had made him memorize as a game when he was 5. A massive, rusted industrial lift, hidden beneath decades of grime, groaned to life. As the car rolled onto the platform, it began to drop into the subterranean darkness just as the first SUV reached the edge. Ethan watched through the rear window as the trackers jumped out, guns raised, only to realize they were staring into an empty pit. The lift settled into a forgotten maintenance tunnel, a remnant of a city built on secrets. Ethan stepped out of the car, the gold ring gleaming in the dim emergency lights. He looked at the 4 giants who were now staring at him not with pity, but with a dawning, terrifying respect. "You didn't just save us," Silas whispered, stepping toward the boy. "I didn't save you to be safe," Ethan said, the ring catching the light as he closed his fist. "I saved you because we have a city to take back. Now, tell me who among my father's council was whispering to Victor before the pier." In that moment, the 4 men didn't see a child. They saw a commander. They knelt, not out of habit, but out of a sudden, desperate belief that the Iron Saint hadn't died at all. he had simply changed form. The subterranean air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-tech world Julian Frost had maintained above ground. In the center of the bunker, under the hum of a flickering halogen light, Ethan sat at a heavy iron desk that looked like it had been forged in the same era as the city's foundations. Before him lay the gold signet ring and a leather-bound ledger he had pulled from a safe hidden behind a false brick. Silas and the others stood at the perimeter, their shadows stretching long across the floor, watching the boy work with a mixture of reverence and unease. For hours, Ethan didn't move. He wasn't looking for bank account numbers or GPS coordinates for hidden stashes of cash. He was staring at the inner band of the ring, where a series of microscopic, hand-etched characters caught the light. To anyone else, it was a jeweler's mark. To Ethan, it was the key to a cipher Julian had taught him through bedtime stories of the king and his hidden spies. As he began to cross-reference the ring's engravings with the seemingly random dates in the ledger, the true nature of the Iron Saint's power began to unfurl. It wasn't gold that had kept the wolves at bay for 20 years. It was leverage. The names didn't belong to soldiers or rival captains. They belonged to the very people who were supposed to be hunting them. "It's not a map to a treasure, Silas," Ethan whispered, his voice echoing in the hollow space. He traced a line of text that listed a date, a dollar amount, and a name that Silas recognized as the current district attorney. "It's a census of the city's soul." The guards moved closer, their eyes widening as they scanned the pages. The ledger contained a meticulous record of every judge, senator, and high-ranking police official who had ever accepted a saintly favor or a heavy bribe from Julian Frost. It was a directory of moles, men and women strategically placed in every branch of the government, bound to the Frost family by the iron chains of their own greed. "My father didn't rule New York because he was the strongest," Ethan said, looking up, his expression devoid of the warmth of childhood. "He ruled it because he owned the light that tried to shine on him. Victor thinks he's fighting for a throne, but he doesn't realize the throne is built on a foundation of blackmailed ghosts." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Julian hadn't left Ethan a fortune. He had left him a detonator. The secret was the ability to collapse the entire power structure of the East Coast with a single phone call. "Victor wants this book," Ethan continued, closing the ledger with a soft, final thud. "He wants to be the one holding the leash." But he forgot that the saint never gave the leash to anyone but his blood. Ethan stood up, the oversized ring now hanging from a chain around his neck, resting against his heart like a shield. He looked at the four men, his gaze as cold and calculating as the ledger itself. "We aren't going to hide anymore. We're going to find out which of these names belongs to the person who opened the door for the hitmen on the pier. And then, we're going to remind them why they feared the saint." The safe house in Queens was a far cry from the marble-floored estates Ethan had known, a cramped apartment above a laundromat that smelled of industrial soap and desperation. It was here that Ethan began to weave his first web. He sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass, while Silas stood behind him, hesitant. They had leaked their location just enough for the right person to find them. Uncle Alberto, Julian's oldest associate and the man Ethan's ledger had flagged as the primary bridge to the rival families. When the heavy tread of expensive leather shoes sounded in the hallway, Silas and the guards vanished into the shadows of the kitchen and the stairwell. Ethan remained. He discarded the heavy gold ring into a drawer and pulled on a sweater that was a size too large, making him look smaller, more fragile. He sat on the floor with a set of wooden blocks, his expression shifting from the cold steel of a commander to the wide-eyed, hollow-checked grief of a child who had lost everything. The door creaked open, and Alberto stepped in. He was a large man with a silver mustache and a voice like gravel, smelling of expensive cologne and treachery. He knelt beside Ethan, his face twisted into a mask of paternal concern that didn't reach his sweating brow. "Ethan, my boy," he whispered, reaching out a hand that trembled slightly. "Thank God you're safe. Victor is looking everywhere for you. You have to come with me. Give me your father's ring, and I'll take you somewhere the wolves can't find you." Ethan looked up, his lip quivering with a practiced precision that would have made a stage actor envious. "He's gone, Uncle Al." Ethan sobbed, the sound so raw it made Silas, watching from the dark, feel a chill of genuine horror. "They took him. I'm so scared. I have the ring, but I don't know what it means. It's too heavy." Alberto's eyes gleamed with a sudden, ugly hunger. He leaned closer, his hand closing over Ethan's shoulder. "I know, son. I know. Just tell me where it is. I'll carry the weight for you. We'll go to the private hangar together." "Is that where the others are?" Ethan asked, his voice small and innocent. "The men who helped you on the pier?" Alberto froze. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What did you say?" Ethan's sobbing stopped instantly. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and the mask of the orphan fell away, revealing the Iron Saint beneath. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced by a terrifying, predatory calm. "The ledger said you owed the Russians $3 million, Alberto. It said you sold the pier coordinates to clear the debt." Ethan stood up, no longer looking like a child, but like a judge. "I wanted to see if you'd say his name. But you only wanted the gold." Before Alberto could reach for his weapon, the shadows in the room came alive. Silas's gun was pressed against the back of the trader's head before he could even stand. Ethan looked down at the man who had been his uncle for 7 years, his gaze as cold as the rain outside. "You're right about one thing, Alberto. The ring is a man's burden. And you aren't half the man my father was." Ethan turned his back on the trader, walking toward the drawer to reclaim his crown. "Take him to the basement," the boy commanded, his voice devoid of pity. "He has more names to give us before the night is over." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had been cleared of its usual socialites and replaced by a gathering of monsters. Under the weight of crystal chandeliers, the vultures had assembled for a banquet that was less about food and more about the dissection of a fallen god. Victor sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by the heads of the 3 families Julian Frost had once kept under his heel. They laughed, their voices echoing off the gold-leafed walls, as they laid out maps of the city like children dividing a playground. They spoke of the Iron Saint in the past tense, a relic of a moral code that no longer existed. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open. They were thrown back with a violence that silenced the room instantly. The laughter died in the throats of men who had spent their lives killing, replaced by a sudden, irrational chill. Through the doorway walked Ethan. He was dressed in a miniature version of his father's signature suit, charcoal wool, tailored to perfection, with a white silk tie that looked like a streak of lightning against his chest. He didn't look like a boy attending a funeral. He looked like a king returning from exile. Behind him, the 4 giants, Silas, Cale, Marcus, and Jude, marched in a diamond formation, their footfalls synchronized, their hands resting visibly on the grips of their weapons. They were no longer just guards. They were the heralds of a new era. Ethan walked the length of the long room, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his polished dress shoes the only sound in the vacuum of the ballroom. He didn't stop until he reached the foot of the table, staring directly up at Victor. "You're in my father's chair," Ethan said. His voice wasn't high-pitched or trembling. It was a low, resonant iron that seemed to vibrate the very glasses on the table. Victor recovered his bravado, a cruel smirk twisting his face. "The pup has come to beg for scraps. Did you bring the ring, Ethan? Or did you just come to watch us bury the rest of your name?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold signet ring. He didn't hand it over. He placed it on the table with a sharp clack that sounded like a gunshot. "I didn't come to beg, Victor. And I didn't come for the chair. I came to give you the only mercy the Frost family has left." He scanned the faces of the other bosses, his eyes moving with a predatory intelligence that made men twice his age look away. "I know which of you paid the snipers. I know which of you provided the cars. And I know which of you has a daughter in boarding school and a wife in the Hamptons whose lives depend on the saint's silence." The blood drained from the faces of the men at the table. They looked at each other, the realization dawning that the boy didn't just have his father's eyes. He had his father's ledgers. "The ultimatum is simple," Ethan continued, his small hand resting beside the ring. Leave this city by dawn. Leave your territories, your guns, and your greed. If you stay, the secrets my father kept to protect this city will be released to every federal agency in the country. You won't just lose your empires. You will lose your lives in a cage. You're a child, Victor roared, standing up and reaching for his holster. Before his fingers could touch leather, 4 red laser dots appeared on his chest, perfectly centered. Silas didn't even flinch. I am the Iron Saint's son, Ethan corrected, his voice dropping to a whisper that filled the room. And unlike my father, I don't believe in second chances. The banquet is over. The ultimatum hung in the air for only a heartbeat before the ballroom's opulence was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic percussion of gunfire. Victor's roar of defiance was cut short as he dove behind the heavy mahogany table, signaling his hidden shooters to open fire from the mezzanine. The vultures had no intention of leaving by dawn. They intended to end the Frost bloodline right there on the Persian rugs. But as the first round of lead whistled through the air, Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover like a frightened child. He stepped backward, entering the center of the diamond formation as Silas, Cale, Marcus, and Jude became a seamless, shifting wall of black Kevlar and lethal intent. The ballroom erupted into a symphony of chaos, shattering crystal, splintering wood, and the thunderous roar of submachine guns. From the center of his protective fortress, Ethan stood with a terrifying, calculated stillness. He wasn't looking at the muzzle flashes. He was looking at the tactical flow of the room, his mind processing the battlefield with the cold precision Julian had spent years cultivating. Mezzanine, 10 o'clock. Ethan's voice rang out, clear and steady over the noise. Cale, suppress. Jude, the service door is opening. Sweep the flank. The giants moved exactly as commanded. Cale pivoted, his rifle spitting fire toward the balcony, while Jude spun to neutralize a squad of hitmen bursting from the kitchens. Ethan moved with them, a small sun at the center of a dark orbit, his eyes never leaving the table where Victor was pinned down. He wasn't just surviving. He was directing a masterpiece of violence. When a grenade skidded across the floor, Ethan didn't scream. Marcus, shield, he commanded. The massive guard stepped into the blast radius, his reinforced briefcase unfolding into a ballistic barrier that absorbed the shockwave, while Ethan remained untouched, his white silk tie barely fluttering in the heat. They're reloading, Silas, Ethan whispered, sensing the momentary lull in the mezzanine's fire. Now, advance. The diamond moved forward, a slow, unstoppable juggernaut of iron and lead. The rival bosses, seeing their shooters falling and their power evaporating, began to break. One by one, they scrambled for the exits, realizing that they weren't fighting a boy, they were fighting a ghost who knew their every move. Victor scrambled from behind the table, his face a mask of sweating terror, reaching for a secondary weapon. But Ethan was already there, the 4 giants parting like a curtain to reveal the boy standing just 5 feet away. The air was thick with the smell of spent brass and expensive smoke. Ethan looked at the man who had betrayed his father, his expression devoid of the saint's mercy. He didn't need to pull a trigger. The battlefield was already won. The ballroom, once a place of celebration for the vultures, had become their cage. Ethan reached up and adjusted his collar, the gold ring around his neck gleaming through the haze. You thought the iron was a person, Victor, Ethan said, his voice the final sound in the sudden silence. But the iron is a law, and you just broke it for the last time. The rain had finally tapered off into a haunting, low-hanging mist by the time the mahogany casket was lowered into the Frost family vault. The cemetery was a sea of black umbrellas and silent, watchful eyes. Every major player left in the city was there, standing at a distance, watching the small boy who hadn't shed a single tear throughout the service. Julian Frost was gone, returned to the earth he had ruled with iron and prayer, but the atmosphere wasn't one of an ending. It felt like a long, bated breath. An hour later, the heavy oak doors of the Frost Estate library swung shut, sealing out the noise of the morning world. The room was dim, lit only by the amber glow of the fireplace and the cold, blue light of the evening seeping through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan sat at the head of the massive conference table, the saint's chair. It was a seat designed for a giant, and though Ethan's feet barely reached the edge of the cushion, he no longer looked small. Silas, Cale, Marcus, and Jude stood behind him, their presence no longer a guard for a child, but a shadow for a sovereign. On the table before Ethan lay the ledger and the gold signet ring. The boy reached out, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at the ring with the curiosity of a son anymore. He looked at it as a craftsman looks at a tool. He slid the ring onto his finger. It was still too large, but as he closed his fist, the gold bit into his skin, the weight of it anchoring him to the floor. "The vultures are gone," Silas said quietly, breaking the silence. "The families have withdrawn to the borders. They're waiting to see what the new saint does next." Ethan looked at the ring, then up at the four men. The soft light of the fire danced in his eyes, but there was no warmth in them, only the hard, polished edge of a diamond. "My father ruled through sanctity and iron," Ethan said, his voice steady and devoid of the tremors of youth. "He gave them a choice. He gave them a chance to be better men. But I have seen the pier. I have seen the banquet." He stood up, the oversized ring catching the light as he rested his hand on the ledger. The transformation was complete. The boy who had spilled tears in the rain was buried in that vault alongside Julian. What remained was something sharper, something refined by the fire of betrayal. "The era of the saint is over," Ethan declared, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile, sharp and cold, touched his lips. "From tonight, the city doesn't need a saint. It needs a master who knows its secrets. Tell the families the Frost line isn't just alive. It's awake." He turned toward the window, looking out over the sprawling, glowing grid of New York. The city was a machine of millions, and he finally held the key to every gear. The crown was heavy, and the seat was far too large, but as Ethan Frost stared into the dark, he knew he would never be small again. The silent saint had risen, and the underworld was about to learn that while iron can break, silence is forever.